I came across a story about the Lion Monument in Lucerne recently, and it paints this hauntingly specific picture of the national psyche.
Oh, yeah, I know the one. It commemorates the Swiss mercenaries during the French Revolution.
Exactly. They refused to flee, even when King Louis XVI basically gave them permission to save themselves.
Right. They were told they could go.
And they chose to die at their posts. But the reason why is what's so fascinating. It wasn't, blind loyalty to a foreign king.
No, not at all. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation.
A completely cold calculation. They reasoned, if we break this contract, our descendants will lose their future livelihood.
So they were thinking generations ahead, even in that moment. They valued future credibility over their own immediate survival.
Over their own lives? I mean, it's incredible. And then you fast forward to today, and you see that exact same almost rigid discipline playing out in a modern voting booth.
You're talking about the inheritance tax vote?
Yes. The ballot proposed a 50% inheritance tax on the super rich, essentially a massive financial windfall for the state.
In almost any other country, that would be a slam dunk.
You would think so, right? You'd expect the average working class voter to just jump at the chance to redistribute that wealth. It seems like such an easy yes.
But that's not what happened.
Not even close. The result comes in and it's a landslide rejection. 78% of the population voted against it.
Just like they voted against the universal basic income a few years back.
Exactly. And it creates this fascinating, almost paradoxical profile of a citizenry that treats their ballot like a business contract.
Mm-hmm.
While, the rest of the world often votes for short-term relief or populist redistribution, the Swiss seem to be playing this generational long game.
Operating under the belief that eating the rich today means, well, starving the economy tomorrow.
It just makes you wonder, is this the ultimate form of civic responsibility, or are they living in what the psychologist Carl Jung called a state of chronic low-intensity war?
Well, that paradox you just laid out, the one connecting, 16th century mercenaries to 21st century tax policy, that is absolutely the core mystery we need to solve today.
It really is.
The stability and wealth of Switzerland are often discussed, but the mechanism, the way its citizens consistently vote against their own immediate economic self-interest, favoring long-term institutional continuity, is poorly understood globally.
So what's our mission for this deep dive? How do we unpack this?
I think we have to analyze the three core pillars that uphold this unique structure. First, we need to look at the deepest sociological foundations, that rigid contractual duty and that survival ethos you mentioned.
Okay, the cultural bedrock.
Exactly. Then we have to dissect the institutional design, which is deliberately slow, consensus-driven, and really designed with veto power in mind.
So how the machine itself is built.
Right. And finally, we'll break down the economic calculus of the average Swiss voter, why they consistently reject populist redistribution, even when it looks appealing on paper. And, of course, the structural fiscal safeguards that ensure the government have to follow suit.
So we're really investigating whether this system is fundamentally built to reject rapid partisan change and optimize, solely for stability.
That's the question. Is it all about stability at any cost?
Let's start with that anchor then, the sociological part. Because I really think the politics can only be understood if you grasp the cultural and historical weight behind their concept of duty.
I agree. We're talking about something much older and heavier than just modern fiscal policy.
That story of the Lion Monument, it just shows a kind of loyalty defined by future solvency, not by current emotion.
It's such a profound realization when you see it that way. I mean, think about the Swiss Guard in the Vatican.
The ones in the iconic Renaissance armor?
Exactly. The men still wearing that heavy, almost anachronistic armor. It seems ceremonial, maybe even a bit silly to an outsider. But for those who wear it, it represents a deep continuity of service that really informs the national character.
Yeah, the detail I found compelling was a story about the armor itself. I read about a young guard, I think his name was Elias, and he was complaining about the unbearable heat and the stifling weight of the uniform.
And he suggested they modernize it, right? Loosen the protocols.
He did. But his sergeant's response was, it was a profound commentary on this whole idea of Swiss national identity.
It really was. The sergeant told him essentially that the armor isn't primarily for protection.
Right.
He said it's the physical weight of a promise. It's the palpable burden of history and commitment. When you feel that weight on your shoulders, you feel the obligation.
The weight of a promise. That changes everything.
It does. That perspective reframes the 1527 sack of Rome from just a heroic story of sacrifice into a professional fulfillment of terms.
So those 147 Swiss guards who died holding the line,
They weren't just dying out of blind faith or, some emotional fervor for the Pope. They were fulfilling a contract that ensured the future reputation of the Swiss Confederacy as reliable, necessary allies.
that is the crucial distinction, isn't it? This culture views loyalty not as a fleeting emotional state, but as a structural necessity.
A business requirement for survival.
Yeah. And this contractual fidelity acts as an incredibly powerful social glue. We talk so much about societal atomization in other Western nations, where trust declines and people feel disconnected from institutions and from each other.
Mm-hmm.
But in Switzerland, it seems like performing one's duty, even uncomfortable, historically bound duty, provides a sense of belonging and stability.
It does. The individual contribution is the foundation of the national identity, because failure to perform your duty means you're failing the group's reputation. And that has real economic consequences.
This is a concept that goes back centuries then.
Oh, absolutely. The identity is baked right into the national fabric. It's defined by the historical term for the Swiss mercenary, the Reisläufer.
The word itself is so evocative, Reisläufer. It literally translates to running to war. It sounds almost impulsive.
It does, but its cultural and economic meaning is the exact opposite of impulsive. It represents valuing future credibility.
The ability to get the next job.
Exactly. The ability to secure lucrative future contracts and livelihoods for the country over immediate personal comfort or even, as we saw, immediate survival.
And you have to remember the context. Switzerland was, for much of its history, a resource-poor mountain nation.
Their primary exportable commodity was disciplined, highly trained manpower. If you broke faith once, if the mercenaries deserted a losing battle.
Your nation's credibility, and thus its entire economic future, was just gone.
Gone. That reputation of uncompromising fidelity was the bedrock of their economy. And that historical identity, I think, reinforces the long-term, non-impulsive thinking we still see today in their financial and civic decisions.
This inherent focus on disciplined survival, it leads directly to that fascinating psychological definition that Carl Jung proposed.
Right, that Swiss life is lived in a state of chronic, low-intensity war.
It's a critical concept for understanding their societal conservatism, I think.
Absolutely. It's not a literal military conflict, of course. It's a constant internal discipline required to manage this highly diverse, multilingual, resource-scarce environment with fiercely independent cantons all trying to coexist.
So the mentality is forged by a constant need for readiness and efficiency.
Yes. And this ethos psychologically reinforces the idea that domestic competition has to remain high, and therefore laziness and dependence are sins.
Because they actively threaten national stability.
They do. If everyone isn't pulling their weight, if the state starts to encourage dependency, the fragile, decentralized system could collapse under its own complexity. It forces a level of civic responsibility that is maybe optional elsewhere.
And we see that translated directly into their civic mindset today. When a Swiss citizen walks into the voting booth, they aren't just thinking, how can I maximize my disposable income next month?
No, they're performing a duty to this long-term strategy.
It's incredible.
It is. Swiss citizens are characterized as highly educated, exceptionally responsible, and most importantly, not impulsive. When they vote, especially on fiscal matters like the inheritance tax or UBI, they are explicitly prioritizing the future of Switzerland and the descendants.
They're applying that generational long game directly to public policy.
Right. They're ensuring that the system they rely on, the stable infrastructure, the strong currency, the low volatility, all of that remains intact. This explains why they are so wary of measures that look like quick populist fixes, but carry these huge structural risks to the foundation of the economy.
So they calculate risk not based on whether they personally get a payout?
But on whether the national balance sheet or the national reputation is jeopardized, it's a totally different frame of reference.
But doesn't that risk-averse mentality, the one rooted in this low-intensity war discipline, doesn't it also stifle innovation? If they're always prioritizing stability and avoiding mistakes, what opportunities do they miss out on?
That is the essential trade-off. And it's a trade-off the Swiss seem to willingly accept.
They're okay with it.
They knowingly forego the potential for rapid, ambitious, state-led innovation, the kind you might see in highly centralized, fast-moving countries, in exchange for near absolute certainty.
Their system, as we're about to get into, is really designed to veto change.
Precisely. And the result is fewer mistakes, but also slower adaptation. They would much rather grow at 1% with 99% certainty than risk a 5% boom that carries a 20% risk of system failure.
And for a nation whose primary business is holding and managing global wealth, that stability is the innovation.
That's it. Stability is the product they're selling.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. We have a citizenry that's culturally primed for duty and long-term calculation. Now let's look at the institutional structure that channels this discipline. Switzerland's political system is often called a semi-direct democracy, but it seems critically designed less for decisive majority rule and more for, well, stability and veto power.
It is the ultimate veto system. It really is an institutional architecture built around restraint.
How so?
Think of it like a finely tuned machine or maybe a sophisticated vehicle with incredibly powerful brakes, multiple safety features, and a highly sensitive, very slow accelerator.
So the political outcome is almost always consensus.
Yes, but it's achieved not because everyone agrees ideologically, but because the structure forces them to compromise to avoid total systemic paralysis.
Okay, so let's break down those three key instruments of participation that achieve this forced consensus, starting with the most fundamental and stringent one, the constitutional referendum.
This is the most serious form of direct democracy they have. It's mandatory for any amendment to the federal constitution or for major international treaties. It really functions as the primary brakes on the entire system.
And it's incredibly difficult to enact change this way.
Extremely, because it requires a double majority. You need a majority of the people, yes, but you also need a majority of the 26 cantons to approve it.
Which gives rural and minority cantons a disproportionate influence.
It does. It prevents large urban populations from just dominating the national legal framework, and that difficulty translates directly into the results. We noted that historically, something like over a quarter of all constitutional proposals have been rejected.
A quarter? That's a huge number.
It is. But that high rejection rate isn't an accident. It's the system working exactly as intended. It's there to prevent excessive rapid innovation or, federal power creep.
So this constitutional break is a primary reason why the Swiss federal government has relatively few powers compared to its neighbors.
And why state spending is notably low. And why, by international standards, their social welfare system remains pretty modest.
What's a good example of this in action?
The landmark example everyone points to is the 1992 rejection of joining the European Economic Area. That was a massive constitutional shift that was refused by both the people and the cantons. It showed the people's commitment to self-determination and stability over deep integration.
Okay, so that's the big break. Next, we have the optional referendum. This one targets ordinary laws passed by Parliament.
Right, and this only requires 50,000 signatures to challenge a law within 100 days of it being passed.
It sounds less impactful than the constitutional double majority rule, but you're saying its effect might be even more significant in driving daily political behavior.
I think it is. It's the ultimate veto threat that drives the entire consensus engine.
The threat of it.
The real power of the optional referendum lies not in how often it's actually used. Historically, I think only about 7% of laws are actually challenged.
So it's about the 93% of cases where it's preemptively avoided.
Exactly. Parliament knows that if they pass a law without broad cross-party consensus, a small group of 50,000 citizens can force an expensive, lengthy public vote, putting the entire legislative effort at risk.
So the threat of the referendum is the tool that generates compromise, often before the law is even formally introduced.
Precisely. It compels Parliament to consult with interest groups, opposition parties, cantonal representatives, all during the drafting phase. And that leads to these highly watered-down, broadly acceptable compromises.
It puts a restraining leash on the political elite then, regardless of whether they lean left or right.
A very tight leash. Sweeping partisan measures are virtually impossible to enact.
Okay.
And if a law is challenged, the opposition has about a 50% chance of winning, which can completely derail the government's agenda. So this pre-parliamentary consultation and compromise process is vital to understanding the slow, deliberate pace of change.
And it ensures that any new law has wide societal buy-in.
It has to.
And finally, we have the popular initiative. This requires 100,000 citizens to propose an amendment to the Constitution. This is the system's occasional and often frustrated accelerator.
That's a good way to put it. It's the mechanism that allows minority or disgruntled voices to bring up issues that are politically taboo for the consensus-driven parliament.
Like what kind of issues?
Things like specific proposals on immigration, minimum wage caps, or tighter European Union ties. But statistically, it truly is a blunt weapon.
Because they rarely succeed.
Very rarely. Historically, only about 1 in 10 popular initiatives actually succeed. And that's usually because they often seek radical, non-negotiable change that the wider population knows could disrupt stability.
So it's primarily an important outlet for frustration then, a way to put pressure on the political elite, even if the actual proposal fails at the ballot box.
Right. It lets the system vent steam without blowing up.
A political safety valve.
Exactly. And even failed initiatives sometimes bear indirect fruit, with Parliament later incorporating less radical, more consensus-friendly versions of the demands into ordinary legislation. The structure ensures the people retain control over the most important decisions, even if they don't engage in the day-to-day work of the legislature.
And this emphasis on direct control over concrete decisions, that's the trade-off that explains a persistent phenomenon: low voter turnout in their elections.
It is. It's a paradox people always point to.
If the citizens are so highly civic-minded, why do less than half of the electorate usually participate in parliamentary elections?
Because the elections are, structurally, just less important than the referendums. In a system built entirely on consensus and veto threats, the composition in the government and the parliament is less decisive.
The political parties, no matter how fiercely they campaign against each other, know they have to collaborate in an oversized coalition afterward anyway.
Right. So the Swiss citizen maximizes their influence on concrete, policy-specific decisions, the referendums, at the cost of high influence during elections. Why bother casting a vote that won't fundamentally change the composition of the government or its overarching, slow-moving policy direction?
It's a kind of rational apathy.
It is. It's a logical choice within their system.
This inherent drive for compromise brings us to the Concordance system. This is the formal term for that political consensus model that aims to integrate all major groups into the executive process.
Yes, and concordance democracy stands in stark opposition to competitive majority democracy, like the kind practiced in Westminster or Washington,
where winners take all and parties alternate in power.
The Swiss system requires integrating all the major parties into the 7-member Federal Council. That's the executive branch, ensuring proportionality based on the country's political forces.
So they don't have the typical alternation between a ruling party and a clear opposition party that we see elsewhere. The government has been consistently stable for over a century.
Since 1848, the executive has never been entirely changed in one go. The famous magic formula, which was used from 1959 to 2003, ensured formal representation from the 4 largest parties.
But the crucial, almost impossible element holding this coalition of 7 individuals from antagonistic parties together is the principle of collegiality.
Ah, yes, collegiality. It's the linchpin.
It dictates that once the 7-member council reaches a majority decision, all members, even those who vehemently disagreed in private, have to publicly and actively defend that official government position.
They have to become a single, unified voice.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, but it's the ultimate stabilizer. It prevents the kind of political whiplash or partisan sabotage that plagues competitive democracies. Imagine a system where the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Treasury, regardless of their party, must speak with one voice on every single policy matter.
It would change everything.
It stabilizes the entire system by forcing genuine political compromise and preventing individual council members from using their position to undermine the collective government. And again, it's the necessity of constantly anticipating and avoiding referendums that compels them to maintain these coalitions and adhere to collegiality in the first place.
Because failure to cooperate invites a public veto.
No one wants that.
Okay, finally, institutional stability is profoundly secured by federalism and local autonomy. This is a bottom-up structure, you said, where the 26 cantons pre-existed and came together to form the country.
And that creates a deeply embedded structure of non-centralization, which is arguably the most powerful check against political overreach. Federalism acts as a critical check against the majoritarian tendencies that characterize illiberal democracies.
Because of the double majority again.
Yes. If you want to change the Constitution, you need the majority of voters and the majority of the cantons. This protects rural, linguistic, or political minority cantons from being swamped by the urban centers. It ensures that major decisions require true, dispersed national consent.
And on the ground, this bottom-up structure creates fierce economic competition, which keeps a pressure on local governments to perform.
Precisely. The cantons and municipalities retain wide fiscal sovereignty. They collect substantial tax revenue, far more proportionally than local governments in the US or Canada.
And this competitive environment is Darwinian.
It is. It keeps taxes and regulations in check, because citizens and businesses can literally vote with their feet. If a canton raises taxes too high or imposes burdensome regulations, capital and high-income earners simply move to the neighboring canton.
So this constant competitive pressure ensures efficiency and local responsiveness.
And it acts as a massive disincentive for local populist or excessive spending policies. You can't afford to be irresponsible when your tax base can just walk away.
So the system is designed from top to bottom for stability and consensus. Now, let's return to the modern puzzle we started with. Why, given the opportunity for a massive financial windfall, did 78% of the population reject the 50% inheritance tax? Why do they consistently reject redistribution?
It's the ultimate convergence of that long-term contractual psyche meeting these institutional veto mechanisms we've just discussed. The rejection of the inheritance tax just mirrors the failure of all these similar proposals.
Like taxing capital gains, capping executive pay.
And critically, the 2016 rejection of the Universal Basic Income, or UBI. Internationally, the theoretical support for these ideas is often high. But when the Swiss face the actual proposal, their calculus just flips from ideological sympathy to pure economic risk assessment.
They fear the consequences more than they desire the short-term payout.
Much more.
Let's revisit that story about the baker of Bern and the UBI vote. That anecdote really captures the cultural skepticism toward what you might call the therapeutic state that promises to fix social ills with a check.
Indeed. The proposal was highly publicized, giving every adult 2,500 Swiss francs a month. No strings attached.
Sounds great on paper.
It does. But the story highlights the skepticism of average working people, like Margaret, the dry cleaner. She wasn't primarily worried about the cost to the state.
What was she worried about?
She was worried about the cost to the national character and to individual agency. Her famous question was something like, if my grandson knows the check comes, whether he fixes the machine or not, will he ever learn the pride of fixing the machine? Of being self-reliant.
Wow. So she wasn't rejecting money, she was rejecting the erosion of agency and the work ethic.
Exactly. This suggests that the Swiss define freedom not as freedom from work, but freedom to work and contribute.
That's a profound difference in worldview.
It is. It's a core cultural concern that underpins their political decisions. They fear that guaranteed income money without condition robs people of the fundamental reason to get out of bed. This deep-seated belief reflects that chronic low-intensity war mentality, where contribution, self-reliance, and avoiding dependence are moral and civic duties.
So rejecting the UBI was a collective prioritization of agency and self-respect tied to productive work over dependency on the state.
It was a moral vote, not an economic one, for many, many people.
And that concept translates perfectly to the rejection of the inheritance tax, but on a macro scale. Which brings us to the factory in the valley example. This shows the foresight of blue-collar workers.
This anecdote perfectly illustrates how average workers apply a kind of macroeconomic foresight that is often missing in other democracies. Take the precision tooling factory in Nidwalden.
Okay.
The owner's wealth was not sitting in liquid cash. It was tied up in the means of production, the cutting edge, expensive machinery, the patents, the land.
The factory itself.
Right. A 50% inheritance tax would have instantly forced the family, upon the owner's death, to liquidate assets. Specifically, they'd have to sell off roughly 30% of the factory's machinery just to pay the tax bill to the federal government.
And that would inevitably lead to massive cost cutting.
Including laying off 40 local workers.
And the workers, the very people who would theoretically benefit the most from an influx of new tax revenue, they campaigned fiercely against the initiative.
They did. Their calculus was strikingly sophisticated and long-term. They were essentially saying, we don't want a government check for 1 year. We want this factory to be here, employing our children and stabilizing our local community for the next 20 years.
They understood the tax was not just taxing the rich owner.
It was taxing the capital stock that guaranteed their employment. They prioritized the longevity of the local enterprise and the stability of a long-term system over an immediate, potentially destabilizing populist payout.
This speaks to the overarching cost argument. Voters exhibit massive risk aversion when faced with financial proposals that could disrupt the stable equilibrium.
The opponents of the inheritance tax were highly effective because they knew exactly how to play on this risk aversion. While the average Swiss might be sympathetic to the goal of taxing the ultra-rich, they back down when the No campaign highlights the credible arguments about economic fallout, capital flight, and business uncertainty.
And the core argument was simple.
Very simple. This tax would undermine Switzerland's attractiveness, encourage a small number of very large taxpayers to relocate, and ultimately shrink the overall tax base, harming social services in the long run.
And even if the immediate economic projections were slightly exaggerated,
the uncertainty alone was enough to convince the overwhelming majority to stick to the stable status quo. They choose the devil they know, a stable, predictable tax environment, over the one they don't.
This leads to the fundamental question: what is the true premium asset Switzerland is selling? It's not the lowest taxes alone. You can find lower tax rates elsewhere.
It's institutional predictability and multi-generational wealth management.
Institutional continuity is the product.
That's it. For the ultra-high net worth segment, the decision is rarely about a single tax line item. It's about the full stack. Strong legal protections, reliable enforcement, extremely high quality of life, highly functional infrastructure, and most importantly, the confidence that the jurisdiction won't change the deal on a whim.
So the landslide rejection of the inheritance tax is a clear institutional-level signal to global capital.
It's a signal that Switzerland is doubling down on being a low-volatility wealth preservation hub.
And if you contrast that with other global wealth centers, say the UAE, which attracts massive inflows with zero personal income tax and hyper-flexibility, you see a completely different model.
A very different model. The UAE is a high-velocity wealth accumulation hub. It's optimized for entrepreneurs and traders who prioritize speed and immediate tax simplicity.
Switzerland, on the other hand.
Switzerland attracts long-duration, multi-generational capital that values permanence. If you are planning succession across 3 generations, you need a jurisdiction that is slow, deliberate, and whose policy changes must survive intense public and cantonal scrutiny.
The Swiss system, by design, changes slowly.
Which is exactly why it commands a premium for global wealth managers. It is the political equivalent of a high-grade safety deposit box.
Okay, now we need to shift our focus from culture and politics to the purely fiscal. We have to discuss the debt brake, a constitutional mandate for structural balance introduced back in 2002. This seems like the ultimate expression of that collective non-impulsiveness, but applied to federal finances.
It is the pinnacle of Swiss fiscal discipline, and it was approved by an overwhelming 84.7% of voters.
Which shows how much they wanted it.
They desperately wanted it after the budget crisis of the 1990s. That decade saw the federal public debt balloon to over 50% of GDP. It forced politicians and the public to realize that the fragmented nature of the Swiss government, with multiple parties and multiple veto points, created what they called a political deficit bias.
Everyone wanted to spend, but no one wanted to raise taxes.
The classic dilemma. The debt brake was designed to be a rigid constitutional solution to stop that bias in its tracks.
How exactly does this mechanism work to ensure a structurally balanced budget over the entire business cycle, not just year by year? It must be highly technical to account for economic fluctuations.
It is, but the core principle is fairly straightforward. The debt brake uses a specific formula to enforce structural balance. The central idea is that the expenditure limit, let's call it EL, must equal the estimate of structural revenue, or SR, multiplied by a cyclical factor, which they call $10.
Okay, so the formula is old dollars, SR, KI dollar. What is that cyclical factor, $10?
The crucial element is Cal dollar. It's the ratio of predicted trend GDP to predicted actual GDP. So if $10 is greater than 1, it means the economy is performing below its long-term trend. We're in a recession.
And if $10 is less than 1?
The economy is booming. It's performing above its trend.
So if the economy is in a recession, with $10 being greater than 1, the formula allows for what's called passively anti-cyclical policy. You're actually permitted to run a deficit.
Exactly. Your expenditure limit is higher than your current revenue. And conversely, if it's a boom where $10 is less than 1, you are forced to generate a surplus to pay down past debt.
It forces the budget to be neutral across a full business cycle.
Precisely. And simulations using historical data confirm that the mechanism generally works as intended to generate a balanced account over time. It enforces long-term fiscal discipline. Interestingly, the anti-cyclical effect is often better than expected. But that's largely because of large errors in revenue forecasts early in a recession, which inadvertently smooth fiscal policy rather than the factor to lie alone.
It's a mechanism that forces prudence even when the predictions are wrong.
That's a great way to put it.
But calculating something like trend GDP isn't an objective scientific exercise. It's inherently a political decision based on economic models. That has to introduce the potential for political manipulation, right?
Absolutely. That is where the technical mechanism becomes politically charged. Trend GDP is the non-inflationary, non-cyclical output potential of the economy. If policymakers want to spend more, they have a powerful incentive to overestimate the trend GDP.
Which would artificially increase the cyclical factor to dollars and allow a higher expenditure limit?
Exactly. The mechanism tries to mitigate this by requiring the calculation of trend GDP to be based on internationally recognized, standardized economic models, but it is still a potential weakness that requires constant vigilance for the legislature.
And the debt brake isn't just a guideline, it has real teeth. What's the sanction mechanism that forces adherence?
It is quite rigid. If actual expenditure exceeds the expenditure allowed ex post, the difference is debited to an adjustment account.
An adjustment account.
Yes, and this is the critical tool for enforcement. If that accumulated deficit, the running total of mistakes or overspending, exceeds 6% of the previous year's total spending, Parliament is constitutionally obligated to correct and compensate for that deficit in the following 3 years.
But there's no escaping it.
Not easily. And furthermore, the exclusion of extraordinary revenue, like a sudden sale of state assets, prevents short-term cosmetic fixes designed to disguise structural issues.
But despite this rigorous design, the system has clear vulnerabilities. Let's look at the identified weak spots, starting with the possibility of classifying expenditures as extraordinary.
Loophole number 1. This is the ability to place extraordinary spending. So, one-off unforeseen events like true disaster relief, military mobilization, or a pandemic response outside the limit by a majority vote of both chambers of Parliament.
Which you need for real emergencies.
You do. But the clause creates the danger of setting a dangerous political precedent. If regularly recurring or planned items like major road investments, routine defense modernization, or even unexpected but predictable demographic costs are categorized as extraordinary year after year just to bypass the limit,
then the entire rule loses its structural validity.
Exactly. That kind of exploitation would fundamentally undermine the constitutional mandate for structural balance.
That seems dangerous, but the more critical vulnerability seems to be its non-application to the financial plan. This is where the political manipulation of future spending really happens.
This is loophole 2, and it directly reintroduces the spending without financing problem that the debt brake was meant to eliminate in the first place.
Because the brake only applies to the current budget.
Right. The brake applies only to the current budget and the final accounts of that year. It does not apply to the financial plan, which covers the 3 to 4 years following the current budget. And this provides a clear political window of opportunity.
Can you walk us through the political incentive here?
Certainly. A politician can introduce a law today, say a promise for a massive new subsidy or a future defense procurement program that creates a spending commitment 3 or 4 years down the line.
But they don't have to propose the current funding for it.
Not at all. Since the debt brake doesn't apply to the financial plan period, the spending commitment is essentially unfinanced in the out years.
And by the time that future year arrives and the commitment becomes part of the actual annual budget,
the structural deficit it causes is suddenly too large to correct in a single year without causing massive disruption. The government is then forced to declare an adjustment path, which is a temporary suspension or circumvention of the debt brake to slowly correct the deficit over several years.
Which is exactly what happened in 2003, right after the brake was implemented.
Exactly. An unexpected structural deficit was discovered, and the only solution was the political necessity of defining a multi-year adjustment path. If this loophole is exploited repeatedly by future parliaments seeking to make unfunded promises, the debt brake loses its credibility and its political power to restrain long-term spending growth.
But despite these vulnerabilities, you're saying the positive influence shouldn't be overlooked.
No, it shouldn't. The mechanism has fundamentally raised the awareness of both government and parliament regarding fiscal limits and budget constraints. It's made Swiss federal finance significantly more conservative than its European peers. The debt brake aims for a strict zero deficit of the financial account, which makes it one of the most restrictive constitutional rules of its type anywhere in the world.
So what we've analyzed today is this unique, deeply integrated system. We started with a specific cultural discipline rooted in the contractual duty and the survival ethos of the rice lifer.
This deep cultural template.
And it's then filtered through an institutional design, semi-direct democracy, the Concordance system, and federalism that is deliberately optimized for veto power and slow consensus.
And finally, this entire structure is safeguarded by these rigid fiscal mechanisms like the debt brake.
So what's the synthesis here?
The synthesis is clear. The Swiss political system is intentionally designed to be slow, deliberate, and compromise-driven. It optimizes not for speed or for partisan victory, but for stability and confidence.
And every major policy shift, especially concerning wealth or state spending, has to survive a process that allows for multiple veto points.
From the 50,000 signatures required for an optional referendum, to the double majority required for a constitutional change, to the stringent rules of the debt brake. It requires the average citizen to calculate the long-term economic risk to the nation and to their descendants, constantly preferring continuity over immediate gratification.
And when you step back, the sheer inertia of the Swiss system,
Right.
the overwhelming rejection of populist redistribution, the low volatility, the high confidence, it begins to look less like a series of individual votes,
And more like a singular, coherent, multi-generational strategy.
where the population acts as a collective board of directors for the nation's long-term enterprise.
The ultimate lesson of Switzerland is that when a citizenry operates with the rigor of a signed contract, they choose the predictability that ensures longevity. They understand, fundamentally, that institutional and economic stability itself is the most valuable form of social and economic wealth. They are willing to sacrifice short-term gains, knowing that their refusal to change the deal is the most profitable asset they possess.